Today we are continuing with Chapter 2 of The Gift, the extension of this system, liberality, honor, money. Part 1. The Rules of Generosity and the Andaman Islands. First, these customs are also to be found among the Pygmies, who, according to Father Schmidt, are the most primitive of peoples. According to the notes, Mauss is not in agreement with this. They have a lot of information that they didn't actually include in the chapter, and I can't for love or money determine why. Continuing with the audiobook. As early as 1906, Brown observed facts of this kind among the Andaman Islanders of the North Island, and described them extremely well with regard to hospitality between local groups and visitors to festivals and fairs that serve as occasions for voluntary and obligatory exchanges, a trade in ochre and sea products against the products of the forest, etc. Quote begins, "In spite of the considerable volume of these exchanges, since the local group and the family, in other cases, know how to be self-sufficient in tools, etc., these presents do not serve the same purpose as commerce and exchange in more developed societies. The goal is, above all, a moral one, the object being to foster friendly feelings between the two persons in question, and if the exercise failed to do so, everything had failed. Nobody is free to refuse the present that is offered. Everyone, men and women, tries to outdo one another in generosity. A kind of rivalry existed to see who could give the greatest number of objects, of the greatest value." Quote ends. Presents put the seal upon marriage and form a link of kinship between the two pairs of parents. They give the two sides the same nature, and this identical nature is made clearly manifest in the prohibition that, from the first betrothal vows to the very end of their days, places a taboo on the two groups of parents, who, from then onwards, do not see each other or communicate verbally, but continue constantly to exchange presents. In reality, this prohibition expresses both the close relations and the fear that reign between this type of reciprocal creditors and debtors. The proof that this is the underlying principle is shown by the fact that the same taboo, indicative simultaneously both of closeness and remoteness in relationships, is also established between young people of both sexes who have undergone at the same time the ceremonies of eating turtle and eating pig, who are likewise bound for life to exchange presents. Facts of this kind are also observed in Australia. Brown again reports on the rituals of meeting after a long separation, the act of embrace, the greeting made in tears, and shows how the exchange of presents is their equivalent, and how feelings and persons are mixed up together. In short, this represents an intermingling. Souls are mixed with things, things with souls. Lives are mingled together, and this is how, among persons and things so intermingled, each emerges from their own sphere and mixes together. This is precisely what contract and exchange are. Part 2. Principles, reasons, and the intensity of exchange of gifts. Melanesia. More so than the people of Polynesia, those of Melanesia have preserved or developed the potlatch, although this is not a matter that concerns us here. In any case, The Melanesians, better than the Polynesians, have on the one hand preserved, and on the other developed the whole system of gifts and this form of exchange. Since, moreover, with the former, the notion of money emerges much more clearly than in Polynesia. The system becomes in part complicated, but is also more clear-cut. New Caledonia. Here we again find not only those ideas that we seek to highlight, but even their expression in the characteristic documents that Leeuwenhoek has collected about the New Caledonians. He began by describing the Pilu Pilu and the system of festivals, gifts, and services of all kinds that we should not hesitate to term potluck. The legal term used in the solemn speeches made by the herald are entirely typical. Thus, at the ceremonial presentation of festival yams, the herald says, "If there is some ancient Pilu before which we have not been, there, among the we, etc., this yam hastens to it as one such a yam came from them to us." It is the thing itself that comes back. Later, in the same speech, it is the spirit of their ancestors who causes to descend upon these portions of food the effects of their actions and strength. The result of the action you have accomplished appears today. Every generation has appeared in its mouth. Another way of representing the legal tie, one no less expressive, is our festivals are the movement of the hook that serves to bind together the various sections of the straw roofing, so as to make one single roof, one single word. It is the same things that return, the same thread that passes through. Other authors also point out these facts. Trobriand Islands. At the other end of the Melanesian world, a very well-developed system is equivalent to that of the New Caledonians. The inhabitants of the Trobriand Islands are among the most civilized of these races. Today they are wealthy pearl fishermen, and before the arrival of the Europeans, they were rich pottery manufacturers and makers of shell money, stone axes, and precious goods. They have always been good traders and bold navigators. Malinowski gives them a name that fits them exactly when he compares them to Jason's fellow voyagers, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. In one of the best volumes of descriptive sociology, focusing, so to speak, on the subject that concerns us, he has described the complete system of inter- and intra-tribal trade that goes under the name of kula. We still await from him the description of all the institutions that are governed by the same principles of law and economics: marriage, the festival of death, initiation, etc. Consequently, the description that we shall give is still only provisional, but the facts are of capital importance and are plain. The kula is a sort of grand potluck, the vehicle for busy intertribal trade. It extends over the whole of the Trobriand Islands, a part of the Entrecastot Islands, and the Amphlett Islands. In all these territories, it indirectly involves all the tribes and directly a few of the larger tribes, the Dobu and the Amphlets in Kiruvina, the Kiruina, the Sinaketa, and Kitav in the Trobriands, and the Vakuta on Woodlark Island. Malinowski gives no translation of Kula, which, doubtless, means circle. Indeed, it is as if all these tribes, these expeditions across the sea, these precious things and objects for use, these types of food and festivals, these services rendered of all kinds, ritual and sexual, these men and women were caught up in a circle, following around this circle a regular movement in time and space. Kula trade is of a noble kind. It seems to be reserved for the chiefs. The latter are at one and the same time the leaders of fleets of ships and boats. They are the traders and also the recipients of gifts from their vassals, who are, in fact, also their children and brothers-in-law, their subjects, and, at the same time, the chiefs of various vassal villages. Trade is carried on in a noble fashion, apparently in a disinterested and modest way. It is distinguished carefully from the mere economic exchange of useful goods, which is called Gimvali. In fact, the latter is carried on as well as the Kula in the large primitive fairs that constitute the gathering of the inter-tribal Kula, or in the small markets of the intra-tribal Kula. It is marked by very hard bargaining between the two parties, a practice unworthy of the Kula. Of an individual who does not proceed in the Kulam with necessary greatness of soul, it is said that he is conducting it like a Gimvali. In appearance, at the very least, the Kula, as in the potlatch in the American Northwest, consists in giving by some and receiving by others. The recipients of one day become the givers on the next. In the most complete form, the most solemn, lofty, and competitive form of the Kula, that of the great sea expeditions, the Uvalaku. It is even the rule to leave without having anything to exchange, without even having anything to give, although it might be exchanged for food, which one refuses even to ask for. One pretends only to receive. It is when the visiting tribe plays host the following year to the fleet of the tribe that has been visited, that the presents will be reciprocated with interest. However, in Kula not given on such a grand scale, advantage is taken of the sea journey to exchange cargoes. The nobles themselves carry on trade. About this there is much native theory. Numerous objects are solicited, asked for, and exchanged, and every kind of relationship is established outside the Kula, which, however, always remains the purpose and the decisive moment in these relationships. The act of giving itself assumes very solemn forms. The thing received is disclaimed and mistrusted. It is only taken up for a moment, after it has been cast at one's feet. The giver affects an exaggerated modesty, having solemnly brought on his present to the sound of a seashell. He excuses himself for giving only the last of what remains to him, and throws down the object to be given at the feet of his rival and partner. However, the seashell and the herald proclaim to everybody the solemn nature of this act of transfer. The aim of all this is to display generosity, freedom, and autonomous action, as well as greatness. Yet, all in all, it is mechanisms of obligation, and even of obligation through things, that are called into play. The essential objects in these exchange gifts are the vegu-a, a kind of money. It is of two kinds. The mvoali, which are beautiful bracelets, carved, polished, and placed in a shell, and worn on great occasions by their owners or relatives, and the sulava, necklaces fashioned by the skilled craftsmen of Sinaketa, in a pretty mother of pearl made from red spondylus. They are solemnly worn by the women, and, in cases of great anguish, exceptionally, by the men. Normally, however, both kinds are hoarded and treasured. They are kept for the sheer pleasure of possessing them. The making of the bracelets, fishing for and making the necklaces into jewelry, the trade in these two objects of exchange and prestige, together with the forms of trade that are more profane and vulgar, constitute the source of the Trobriand people's fortune. According to Malinowski, these vegu-a follow a kind of circular movement. The mavali, the bracelets, are passed on regularly from west to east, whereas sulava always travel from east to west. These two movements in opposite directions occur in all the islands. Trobriand, Entrecastor, Amflet, the remote islands, Woodlark, Marshall Bennett, Tube, and finally the extreme southeast coast of New Guinea, from which come the unworked bracelets. There, this trade meets the great expeditions of the same kind that come from New Guinea, South Massim, which Seligman has described. In principle, the circulation of these signs of wealth is continuous and unerring. They must not be kept too long a time. Nor must one be slow or difficult in passing them on. One should not present them to anyone other than certain partners, nor save in a certain direction, the bracelet or the necklace direction. One can and should keep them from one kula to the next, and the whole community is proud of the vegu-a that one of its chiefs has obtained. There are even occasions, such as in the preparation of funeral ceremonies of Great S'oi, when it is permitted always to receive and to give nothing in return. Yet this is in order to give back everything and to spend everything when the festival has begun. This is indeed ownership that one obtains with the gift that one receives. But it is ownership of a certain kind. One could say that it partakes of all kinds of legal principles that we, more modern, have carefully isolated from one another. It is ownership and possession, a pledge and something hired out, a thing sold and bought, and at the same time deposited, mandated, and bequeathed in order to be passed on to another, for it is only given you on condition that you make use of it for another or pass it on to a third person, the distant partner, the muri. Such is the nature of this economic, legal, and moral entity, which is truly typical, as Malinowski was able to discover, find again, observe, and describe. This institution has also its mythical, religious, and magical aspect. The vegu-a are not unimportant things, mere pieces of money. Each one, at least the dearest and the most sought after, and other objects enjoy the same prestige. Each one has its name, a personality, a history, and even a tale attached to it. So much as this, so that certain individuals even take their own name from them. It is not possible to say whether they are really the object of a cult, for the Trobriand people are, after their fashion, positivists. Yet one cannot fail to acknowledge the eminent and sacred nature of the objects. To possess one is exhilarating, strengthening, and calming in itself. Their owners fondle and look at them for hours. Mere contact with them passes on their virtues. Vegu-a are placed on the forehead, on the chest of a dying person. They are rubbed on his stomach and dangled before his nose. They are his supreme comfort. Yet there is even more to it than this. The contract itself partakes of this nature of the Vegu-a. Not only the bracelets and the necklaces, but even all the goods, ornaments, and weapons. Everything that belongs to the partner is so imbued with it, at least emotionally, if not in his inmost soul, that they participate in the contract. A very beautiful phrase, the enchantment of the seashell, serves after the possessions have been evoked to cast a spell over and move towards the partner candidate the things that he must ask for and receive. Quote begins, "A state of excitement takes hold of my partner. A state of excitement takes hold of his dog. A state of excitement takes hold of his belt." End quote. And so on, his guara, the taboo on coconuts and betel nuts, of his necklace, bagiro-u, of his necklace, bejiriku, of his necklace, bagiduru, etc., etc. Another more mythical, even more curious phrase, but of a more common type, expresses the same idea. The partner of the kula has an animal to assist him, a crocodile that he calls upon that has to bring him the necklaces. In Kitava, the Mvwali, quote begins, "The crocodile falls upon him, carries off your man, and shoves him under the gibobo, the cargo hold on a boat. Crocodile, bring me the necklace. Bring me the bagido-u, the bajiriku, etc." Quote ends. A formula that comes earlier in the same ritual invokes a bird of prey. The last formula of enchantment used by those associated with or contracting in the ritual, at Dobu or at Kitava, by the people of Kirivina, contains a couplet, of which two interpretations are given. Moreover, the ritual is very long and is repeated at length. Its purpose is to enumerate all that the kula proscribes, all the things relating to hatred and war, that must be exorcised in order to be able to trade between friends. Quote begins, "Your fury, the dog turns up its nose at it. Your war paint, the dog turns up its nose at it," etc. Quote ends. The other versions go as follows. Quote begins, "Your fury, the dog is docile at," etc. "Your fury takes off like the tide, the dog plays. Your anger takes off like the tide, the dog plays," etc. Quote ends. This must be understood as, your fury becomes like the dog who is playing. The essential element is the metaphor of the dog that gets up to lick the hand of its master. So the man, if not the woman of Dobu, should also act. A second interpretation, Sophisticated and not untinged with scholasticism, so Malinowski declares, but clearly a very local one, gives a different gloss that ties in better with what we know. Quote begins, "The dogs are playfully nuzzling one another. When you mention this word, dog, the precious things also come to play, as has long been ordained. We have given bracelets, necklaces will come. Both will meet each other, like the dogs who come sniffing at one another." Quote ends. The expression in the form of a parable is a pretty one. The entire set of collective sentiments is expressed at a stroke. The potential hatred between associates, the isolation of the Vegu-A ceasing as if by magic, men and precious things coming together like dogs that play and run up at the sound of one's voice. Another symbolic expression is that of the marriage of the Mvali bracelets, the feminine symbols, and the sulava, the necklaces, the masculine symbols, which stretch out towards each other, as does male towards female. These various metaphors signify exactly the same thing, as is characterized in different terms by the mythical jurisprudence of the Maori. Sociologically, it is once again the mixture of things, values, contracts, and men that is so expressed. Unfortunately, our knowledge of the legal rule that governs the transactions is defective. It is either an unconscious rule imperfectly formulated by the Kiravina people, Malinowski's informants, or it is clear for the Trobriand people it should be the subject of a fresh inquiry. We only possess details. The first gift of the Vegu-A bears the name of Vega, opening gift. It is the starting point, one that irrevocably commits the recipient to make a reciprocating gift, the yotile, which Malinowski felicitously translates as the clinching gift, the gift that seals the transaction. Another name for this latter gift is kudu, the tooth that bites, that really cuts, bites through and liberates. It is obligatory, it is expected, and it must be equivalent to the first gift. Occasionally, it may be seized by force or by surprise. For a yotile that is an insufficient return gift, revenge may be taken by magic, or at the very least, by insult and a display of resentment. If one is not able to reciprocate, at the very least, one may offer a basi, which merely pierces the skin, does not bite, and does not conclude the affair. It is a kind of advance present, whose purpose is to delay. It appeases the former donor, now the creditor, but does not free the debtor, the future donor. These are all curious details, and everything about these expressions is striking. Yet we do not know the sanction behind it. Is it purely moral and magical? The individual who is obdurate at the kula, is he only scorned, and if needs be, cast under a spell? Does the partner who does not keep faith lose anything else, his noble rank, or at least his place among the chiefs? This we still need to know. Yet, from another viewpoint, the system is typical, except for ancient Germanic law that we shall be discussing later. In the present state of our observations and historical, juridical, and economic knowledge, it would be difficult to come across a custom of gift through exchange more clear-cut complete and consciously performed, and moreover, better understood by the observer recording it than the one Malinowski found among the Trobriand people. The kula, its essential form, is itself only one element, the most solemn one, in a vast system of services rendered and reciprocated, which indeed seems to embrace the whole of Trobriand economic and civil life. The kula seems to be merely the culminating point of that life, particularly the kula between nations and tribes. It is certainly one of the purposes of existence and for understanding long voyages. Yet, in the end, only the chiefs, and even solely those drawn from the coastal tribes, and then only a few, do in fact take part in it. The kula merely gives concrete expression to many other institutions, bringing them together. First, the exchange of the vegu-a themselves during the kula forms the framework for a whole series of other exchanges, extremely diverse in scope, ranging from bargaining to remuneration, from solicitation to pure politeness, from out-and-out hospitality to reticence and reserve. In the first place, except for the uvalaku, large-scale solemn expeditions that are purely ceremonial and competitive, all the kula provide the occasion for the Gimvali, which are commonplace exchanges, not necessarily occurring between partners. A free market exists between individuals of allied tribes, side by side with closer associations. In the second place, between partners in a kula there pass, as if in a perpetual chain, additional gifts, presented and reciprocated, as well as obligatory transactions. The kula even takes these for granted. The association that is constituted, and which is the principle of the kula, begins with a first gift, the vaga, that is solicited with all one's might by means of inducements. For this first gift, the future partner, still a free agent, can be wooed, and he is rewarded, so to speak, by a preliminary series of gifts. Whilst one is certain that the reciprocating vegu-a, the yotile, the clinching gift, will be returned, one is not sure that the vaga will ever be given, or even that the inducements will be accepted. This way of soliciting and accepting a gift is the rule. Each of the presents made in this way bears a special name. They are placed on display before being offered. In that case, they are termed pari. Others bear names that indicate the noble and magical nature of the object that is offered. But if one accepts one of these presents, it shows that one is disposed to enter into the game, if not to remain in it for long. Certain names given to these presents express the legal situation that acceptance of them entails. This time the matter is regarded as settled. The present is normally something fairly valuable, for example, a large polished stone axe or a whalebone spoon. To accept it is to bind oneself definitively to making a gift of the vaga, the first present that is sought after. But one is still only half committed as a partner. Only the solemn observance of the traditions commits one completely. The importance and nature of these gifts springs from the extraordinary competition that occurs between the potential partners in the expedition that arrives. They seek out the best possible partner in the opposing tribe. The affair is a serious matter, for the association one attempts to create establishes a kind of clan link between the partners. Thus, to choose, one must attract and dazzle the other person. Whilst rank is taken into account, one must attain one's goal before the others, or in a better way than they do, so bringing about more plentiful exchanges of the most valuable things, which are naturally the property of the richest people. Competition, rivalry, ostentatiousness, the seeking after the grandiose, and the stimulation of interest. These are the various motives that underlie all these actions. These are the arrival gifts. Other gifts, equivalent in value to them, are made in return. These are the departure gifts, called talo'i at Sinaketa. Made upon taking leave, they are always superior to the arrival gifts. Already, the cycle of total services and total counter-services with interest is being completed side by side with the kula. There have been, throughout the time these transactions last, services of hospitality and food, and at Sinaketa, relating to women. Finally, throughout this period, other additional gifts, always reciprocated regularly, are offered. It would even appear to us that the exchange of these korotumna represent a primitive form of the kula, when it consisted also of exchanging stone axes and the rounded tusks of the wild pig. Moreover, in our view, the whole intertribal kula is merely the extreme case, the most solemn and most dramatic one of a more general system. This takes the tribe itself in its entirety out of the narrow sphere of its physical boundaries, and even of its interests and rights. Yet within the tribe, the clans and villages are normally joined by the links of the same kind. In that case, it is only local and domestic groups, together with their chiefs, who leave their homes, pay visits, trade, and intermarry. This may no longer be termed a kula. However, Malinowski, contrasting it with the coastal kula, rightly talks of the internal kula and of kula communities, which provide the chief with the objects he will exchange. However, it is not overstating to speak in such cases of a potluck proper. For example, the visits of the Kiravana people to Kitawa for the Sa'oi, the funeral festivals, include many things other than the exchange of the Vegu'a. One can see them as a kind of simulated attack, Yulavada, and a distribution of food, with a display of pigs and yams. Furthermore, the Vegu'a and all such objects are not always acquired, made, and exchanged by the chiefs themselves. Indeed, it may be said that they are neither made nor exchanged by the chiefs for their own advantage. Most come to the chiefs in the form of gifts from relatives of a lower rank, in particular from brother-in-law, who are at the same time vassals, or from sons who hold land separately as vassals. In return, most of the Vegu'a, upon the return of the expedition, are solemnly passed on to the chiefs of the villages and clans, and even to the common people of associated clans, in brief, to whoever has taken part, directly and often very indirectly, in the expedition. In this way, the latter are compensated. Finally, side by side with, or if one wishes, above, below, and around, and in our opinion, At the bottom of this system of internal kula, the system of gift through exchange permeates all the economic, tribal, and moral life of the Trobriand people. It is impregnated with it, as Malinowski very neatly expressed it. It is a constant give and take. The process is marked by a continuous flow in all directions of presents given, accepted, and reciprocated, obligatorily and out of self-interest, by reason of greatness, and for services rendered, through challenges and pledges. Here, we cannot set out all the facts. Moreover, their publication by Malinowski himself is not yet complete. First, however, here are two main facts. An entirely analogous relationship to that of the Kula, that of the Vasi. It establishes regular acts of exchange, which are obligatory between, on the one hand, agricultural tribes, and on the other hand, coastal tribes. The agricultural partner comes to lay his products in front of the house of his fisherman associate. On another occasion, the latter, after a big fishing expedition, will go to the agricultural village to repay these with interest from the fruits of his catch. It is the same system of division of labor we have noted in New Zealand. Another important kind of exchange takes on the form of exhibitions. Such are the sagali, distributions of food on a grand scale, that are made on several occasions, at harvest time, at the building of the chief's hut, or new boats, or at funeral festivals. These distributions are made to groups that have performed some service for the chief or his clan. Cultivation of the land, the transporting of large tree trunks from which the boats or beams are carved, and for services rendered at funerals by the members of the dead person's clan, etc. These distributions are absolutely equivalent to the Tlingit potluck. Even the themes of combat and rivalry appear. In it, class and phratries and families allied to one another confront one another. Generally, distributions seem to be due to group action, insofar as the personality of the chief does not make itself felt. Yet, in addition to these group rights, and this collective economy, already less resembling the kula, all individual relationships of exchange seem to us to be of this type. Perhaps only a few consist of mere barter. However, as barter is hardly carried on except between relatives, allies, or partners in the kula and the vasi, it does not seem that the exchange is really free. Generally, even what is received and has come into one's possession in this way, in whatever manner, is not kept for oneself unless one cannot do without it. Normally, it is passed on to someone else, to a brother-in-law, for example. It can happen that the identical things one has acquired and then given away come back to one in the course of the same day. All the rewards for total services of any kind, things and services, fall within this category. In random order, the following are the most important: the pokala, the karabutu, solicitory gifts, which we have noted in the kula, are species of a much larger category that correspond fairly closely to what we term remuneration. They are offered to the gods and the spirits. Another generic term for the remuneration is vakapula and mapula. They are the marks of gratitude and hospitable welcome and must be reciprocated. In this connection, in our opinion, Malinowski has made a very great discovery that sheds light upon all the economic and juridical relationships between the sexes within marriage. The services of all kinds rendered to the wife by her husband are considered as a remuneration cum gift for the service rendered by the wife when she lends what the Koran calls the field. The somewhat childish legal language of the Trobriand Islanders has given rise to a proliferation of distinct names for all kinds of total counter services, according to the name of the service that is being compensated, the thing given, the occasion, etc. Certain names take all these considerations into account. For example, the gift made to a magic man, or for the acquisition of a title, is called laga. One cannot credit the extent to which all such vocabulary is complicated by a curious incapacity to divide and define, and by the strange refinements that are given to names. Other Melanesian societies. One need not multiply the comparisons with other areas of Melanesia. However, a few details gleaned here and there will strengthen conviction and prove that the Trobriand people and the New Caledonians have not developed in an abnormal way a principle that might not be found among kindred peoples. At the southern limit of Melanesia, in Fiji, where we have identified the existence of potlatch, other remarkable institutions thrive that belong to the gift system. There is a season termed Kir, during which nobody must be refused anything. Gifts are exchanged between the two families on the occasion of a marriage, etc. Moreover, the money of Fiji, of sperm whales' teeth, is exactly the same kind as that of the Trobriands. It bears the name of tambua. It is decorated with stones, mothers of the teeth, and ornaments that are kinds of mascots, talismans, and good luck objects of the tribe. The feelings cherished by the Fijians for their tambua are exactly the same as those we have just described. They are treated like dolls. They are taken out of the basket and admired. Their beauty is spoken of. Their mother is oiled and polished. To present them constitutes a request. To accept them is to commit oneself. The Melanesians of New Guinea and certain Papuans, influenced by them, call their money tau. It is one of the same kind, and the object of the same belief as that of the Trobriand Islanders. But this name must also be compared with that of tahu ahu, which means the borrowing of pigs, motu and koita, and is a name familiar to us. It is the very Polynesian term, the root of the word teonga, which, in Samoa and New Zealand, means the jewels and possessions incorporated into the family. The words themselves are Polynesian, as are the things. It is known that Melanesians and Papuans of New Guinea practice the potlatch. The fine documents that Thurnwald has passed on to us concerning the tribes of Buin and the Banaro have already provided us with numerous points of comparison. The religious nature of the things exchanged is apparent, particularly that of money, in the way that it rewards songs, women, love, and services. As in the Trobriand Islands, it is a kind of pledge. Finally, Thurnwald has analyzed in a sound case study one of the facts that best illustrates both what this system of reciprocal gifts consists of, and what is incorrectly called marriage by purchase. In reality, this seems to include services to all involved, including the family-in-law. The wife whose parents have not seen sufficient return presents is sent back to them. To sum up, the whole area of the islands, and probably part of the world of southern Asia that is related to it, possess the same legal and economic system. The conception one should have regarding these Melanesian tribes, even richer and more committed to trade than the Polynesians, is therefore very different from normal. These peoples possess an extra-domestic economy and a very developed system of exchange that throbs with life more intensely and more precipitantly, perhaps, than one of our peasants or the fishing villages along our coasts were familiar with, maybe not even 100 years ago. They have an extensive economic life, going beyond the confines of the islands and their dialects, which represents a considerable trade. Through gifts made and reciprocated, they have robustly replaced a system of buying and selling. The stumbling block that these laws and, as we shall see, Germanic law came up against was their inability to isolate and divide up their economic and juridical concepts. But they had no need to do so. In these societies, neither the clan nor the family is able to isolate itself or dissociate its actions. Nor are individuals themselves, however influential and aware, capable of understanding that they need to oppose one another and learn how to dissociate their actions from one another. The chief is merged with his clan, and the clan with him. Individuals feel themselves acting in only one way. Holmes perceptively remarks that in the two dialects, Papuan and Melanesian, one of the tribes that he encountered at the mouth of the Fink River, Torapi and Namau, have one single term to designate buying and selling, lending and borrowing. Operations that are opposites are expressed by the same word. Strictly speaking, they did not know how to borrow and lend in the sense that we employ in these terms, but there was always something given in the shape of an honorarium for borrowing, and which was returned when the loan was repaid. These men have no conception of either selling or borrowing, but nevertheless carry out juridical and economic operations that fulfill the same functions. Likewise, the notion of barter is no more natural for the Melanesians than for the Polynesians. One of the best ethnographers, Cruet, whilst he uses the word selling, describes exactly this state of mind as it exists among the inhabitants of the central Celebes Islands. Yet, the Torajda have been for a long time well in contact with the Malaysians, who are great traders. Thus, one section of humanity, comparatively rich, hard-working, and creating considerable surpluses, has known how to, and still does know how to, exchange things of great value under different forms and for reasons different from those with which we are familiar. Part 3. The American Northwest. Honor and Credit. From these observations about a few Melanesian and Polynesian peoples, there already emerges a very clearly defined picture of this system of the gift. Material and moral life and exchange function within it in a form that is both disinterested and obligatory. Moreover, This obligation is expressed in a mythical and imaginary way, or, one might say, symbolic and collective. It assumes an aspect that centers on the interest attached to the things exchanged. These are never completely detached from those carrying out the exchange. The mutual ties and alliance that they establish are comparatively indissoluble. In reality, this symbol of social life, the permanence of influence over the things exchanged, serves merely to reflect somewhat directly the manner in which the subgroups in these segmented societies, archaic in type and constantly enmeshed with one another, feel that they are everything to one another. Indian societies in the American Northwest display the same institutions, although with them they are even more radical and more marked. First, one can say that barter is unknown. Even after long contact with Europeans, apparently none of the considerable transfers of wealth, constantly taking place among them, is carried out, save in the solemn form of the potluck. We shall describe this institution as it relates to our study. Before doing so, a brief description of these societies is indispensable. The tribes, people, or rather groups of tribes we shall discuss, all reside on the northwest coast of America in Alaska, Tlingit and Haida, and in British Columbia, mainly the Haida, Tsimshian, and Kwalakutul. They also live from the sea, or from the rivers, from fishing rather than hunting. But unlike the Melanesians and Polynesians, they have no agriculture. However, they are very rich, and even now their fishing grounds, hunting grounds, and fur trapping provide them with considerable surpluses, particularly when reckoned in European terms. They have the most solidly built houses of all the American tribes, and a very highly developed cedar wood industry. Their boats are good, and although they hardly venture out in the open sea, they know how to navigate between the islands and the coasts. Their material arts are of a very high order. In particular, even before the arrival of iron in the 18th century, they knew how to extract, melt down, mold, and beat out the copper that is to be found in a raw state in the Tsimshian and Tlingit lands. Certain kinds of this copper, real armorial shields, served as a kind of money for them. Another kind of money was certainly the beautiful, so-called chilkat blankets of wonderfully different colors that still serve as adornment, some of them of considerable value. These peoples have excellent sculptors and professional designers. Their pipes, tomahawks, sticks, spoons carved out of horn, etc., embellish our ethnographic collections. The whole of the civilization is remarkably uniform, within very broad limits. Clearly, these societies mingled with one another from very ancient times, although they belong, at least in language, to no less than 3 different families of people. Their life in winter, even for the southernmost tribes, is very different from that in the summer. The tribes have a dual structure. From the end of spring they disperse to go hunting, to gather roots and the juicy mountain berries, and to fish for salmon in the rivers. At the onset of winter, they concentrate once more in what are called towns. It is then, during the period when they are gathered together in this way, that they live in a state of perpetual excitement. Social life becomes extremely intense, even more so than in the assemblies of tribes that can take place in the summer. There are constant visits from whole tribes to tribes, from clans to clans, and from families to families. There are repeated festivals, continuous and long drawn out. At a wedding or at various kinds of ritual or promotions, everything stored up with great industry during the summer and autumn on one of the richest coasts in the world is lavishly expended. This even occurs in domestic life. The people of one's clan are invited when a seal has been killed, or when a case of berries or roots that have been preserved is opened up. Everyone is invited when a whale is washed up. From the moral viewpoint, also, the civilization is remarkably uniform, although ranging from the regime of the Phratry, Tlingit, and Haida of maternal descent to the clan of modified masculine descent of the Kwakiutl. The general features of social organization, and particularly totemism, are roughly the same in all the tribes. In the Banks Islands, the tribes have brotherhoods, as in Melanesia, which are wrongly called secret societies and are often international, but in which male society, and certainly among the Kwakiutl, female society, cuts across the clan organization. Part of the gifts and total counter services of which we shall speak are intended, as in Melanesia, to finance the ranks and successive ascensions, promotions, in these brotherhoods. The rituals both of these brotherhoods and clans follow one another at the marriage of chiefs, at copper sales, at initiations, at shaman ceremonies, and at funeral ceremonies, the latter being more developed in the Haida and Tlingit lands. All are performed during a series of potlucks that are prolonged indefinitely. There are potlucks everywhere in response to other potlucks. As in Melanesia, it is a constant give and take. The potluck itself is so typical a phenomenon, and at the same time so characteristic of these tribes, is none other than the system of gifts exchanged. It differs from that in Melanesia only in the violence, exaggeration, and antagonisms that it arouses, and by a certain lack of juridical concepts, and a simpler and cruder structure. This is particularly true of the two northern peoples, the Tlingit and Haida. The collective nature of the contract is more apparent than in Melanesia and Polynesia. All in all, these societies, in spite of appearances, are closer to what we term simple total services. Consequently, the juridical and economic concepts possess less clarity and less conscious precision. However, in practice, the principles are positive and sufficiently clear-cut. Nevertheless, two notions are much more in evidence than in the Melanesian potluck, or the more developed, or more fragmented, institutions existing in Polynesia. These are the notion of credit, of the time limit placed on it, and also the notion of honor. Gifts circulate, as we have seen in Melanesia and Polynesia, with the certainty that they will be reciprocated. Their surety lies in the quality of the things given, which is itself that surety. In every possible form of society, it is in the nature of a gift to impose an obligatory time limit. By their very definition, a meal shared in common, a distribution of kava, or a talisman that one takes away, cannot be reciprocated immediately. Time is needed in order to perform any counter service. The notion of a time limit is thus logically involved when there is question of returning visits, contracting marriages and alliances, establishing peace, attending games or regulated combats, celebrating alternative festivals, rendering ritual services of honor, or displaying reciprocal respect. All the things that are exchanged at the same time as other things that become increasingly numerous and valuable as these societies become richer. Current economic and juridical history is largely mistaken in this matter. Imbued with modern ideas, it forms a priori ideas of development and follows so-called necessary logic. All in all, it rests on ancient traditions. There is nothing more dangerous than this unconscious sociology, as Simeon has termed it. For example, Cook still states, quote begins, "In primitive societies, only the barter regime is conceived of in those more advanced. Sales for cash are the practice. Sale on credit is characteristic of a higher phase in civilization. It first appears in an oblique form as a combination of cash sale and loans." Cook, 1910, quote ends. In fact, the point of departure lies elsewhere. It is provided in a category of rights that excludes the jurists and economists who are not interested in it. This is the gift, a complex phenomenon, particularly in its most ancient form, that of total services, with which we do not deal in this monograph. Now, the gift necessarily entails the notion of credit. The evolution in economic law has not been from barter to sale, and from cash sale to credit sale. On the other hand, barter has arisen through a system of presents given and reciprocated according to a time limit. This was through a process of simplification by reductions in periods of time formerly arbitrary. On the other hand, buying and selling arose in the same way, with the latter according to a fixed time limit, or by cash as well as by lending. For we have no evidence that any of the legal systems that have evolved beyond the phase we are describing, in particular Babylonian law, remained ignorant of the credit process that is known in every archaic society that still survives today. This is another simple, realistic way of resolving the problem of the two moments in time that are brought together in the contract, which Davy has already studied. No less important in these transactions of the Indians is the role played by the notion of honor. Nowhere is the individual prestige of a chief and that of his clan so closely linked to what is spent and to the meticulous repayment with interest of gifts that have been accepted, so as to transform into persons having an obligation those that have placed you yourself under a similar obligation. Consumption and destruction of goods really goes beyond all bounds. In certain kinds of potluck, one must expend all that one has, keeping nothing back. It is a competition to see who is the richest and also the most madly extravagant. Everything is based upon the principles of antagonism and rivalry. The political status of individuals in the brotherhoods and clans and ranks of all kinds are gained in a war of property, just as they are in real war, or through chance, inheritance, alliance, and marriage. Yet everything is conceived of as if it were a struggle of wealth. Marriages for one's children and places in the brotherhoods are only won during the potluck, where exchange and reciprocity rule. They are lost in the potluck as they are lost in war by gambling or in running and wrestling. In a certain number of cases, It is not even a question of giving and returning gifts, but of destroying, so as not to give the slightest hint of desiring your gift to be reciprocated. Whole boxes of olachin, candlefish oil, or whale oil are burnt, as are houses and thousands of blankets. The most valuable copper objects are broken and thrown into the water in order to put down and to flatten one's rival. In this way, one not only promotes oneself, but also one's family up the social scale. It is therefore a system of law and economics in which considerable wealth is constantly being expended and transferred. If one so wishes, one may term these transfer acts of exchange, or even of trade and sale. Yet such trade is noble, replete with etiquette and generosity, at least when it is carried on in another spirit, with a view to immediate gain. It becomes the object of very marked scorn. As may be seen, the notion of honor, which expresses itself violently in Polynesia and is always present in Melanesia, is, in this case, really destructive. Again on this point, conventional wisdom misjudges the importance of the motives that have inspired men, and all we owe to the societies that have preceded us. Even such a perceptive scholar as Houvelin felt himself obliged to deduce the notion of honor, reputedly ineffective, from the notion of efficacy of magic. He sees in honor and prestige only a substitute for magic. The reality is much more complex. The notion of honor is no more foreign to these civilizations than is the notion of magic. The Polynesian word mana itself symbolizes not only the magical force in every creature, but also is honor, and one of the best translations of the word is authority, wealth. The Tlingit and Haida potlatch consists of considering the mutual services rendered as acts of honor. Even among really primitive tribes, such as those in Australia, the point of honor is as delicate as that in our own societies, and is satisfied through the offering of services and food, acts of precedence and rights, as well as through gifts. Men had learned how to pledge their honor and their name long before they knew how to sign the latter. The North American potlatch has been well enough studied as regards everything concerning the form of the contract itself. However, we need to fit the study of it made by Davy and Leonhard Adam into the wider context in which it should be placed for the subject with which we are dealing. For the potlatch is much more than a juridical phenomenon. It is one that we propose to call total. It is religious, mythological, and shamanist, since the chiefs who are involved represent and incarnate their ancestors and the gods, whose names they bear, whose dances they dance, and whose spirits possess them. The potlatch is also economic phenomenon, and we must gauge the value, the importance, the reasons for, and the effect of these transactions, enormous even today, when they are calculated in European values. The potlatch is also a phenomenon of social structure, the gathering together of tribes, clans, and families, even of peoples,
brings about a remarkable state of nerviness and excitement. One fraternizes, yet one remains a stranger. One communicates and opposes others in a gigantic act of trade and a constant tournament. We pass over the aesthetic phenomenon, which are extremely numerous. Finally, even from the juridical viewpoint, to what we have already gleaned regarding the form of these contracts and what might be termed their human purpose, as well as the juridical status of the contracting parties, clans, families, ranks, and betrothals, we must add this. The material purposes of the contracts, the things exchanged in them, also possess a special, intrinsic power, which causes them to be given and, above all, to be reciprocated. It would have been useful, if we had enough space, to distinguish for the purposes of our exposition between 4 forms of the potluck in the American Northwest. 1. A potluck in which the phratries and the families of the chiefs are exclusively, or almost exclusively, involved. 2. A potluck in which the phratries, clans, chiefs, and families play roughly equal part. 3. A potluck by clans in which chiefs confront one another. 4. A potluck of chiefs and brotherhoods. But it would take too long to proceed thus. Moreover, the difference between the 3 of the 4 forms have been expounded by Davy. Finally, as far as our study is concerned, that of the 3 themes of the gift, the 3 obligations, to give, to receive, to reciprocate. The obligation to give is the essence of the potluck. A chief must give potlucks for himself, his son-in-law, or his daughter, and for his dead. He can only preserve his authority over his tribe and village, and even over his family. He can only maintain his rank among the chiefs, both nationally and internationally, if he can prove he is haunted and favored both by the spirits and by good fortune, that he is possessed and also possesses it. And he can only prove this good fortune by spending it and sharing it out, humiliating others by placing them in the shadow of his name. Each Kwakiutl and Haida noble has exactly the same idea of face as has the Chinese man of letters or officer. It is said one of the great mythical chiefs who gave no potluck, that he had a rotten face. Here, the expression is even more exact than in China. For in the American Northwest, to lose one's prestige is indeed to lose one's soul. It is, in fact, the face, the dancing mask, the right to incarnate a spirit, to wear a coat of arms, a totem, is really the persona, that are all called into question in this way, and that are lost at the potluck, at the game of gifts, just as they can be lost in war, or through a mistake in ritual. In all such societies, one hastens to give. There is not one single special moment, even apart from the winter solemnities and gatherings, when one is not obliged to invite one's friends, to share with them the windfall gains of the hunt or food gathering, which come from the gods and the totems. There is not one single moment when you are not obliged to redistribute everything from a potluck in which you have been the beneficiary, or when you are not obliged to acknowledge by gifts some service or other, whether performed by chiefs, vassals, or relatives. All this under pain of violating etiquette, at least for nobles, and of losing rank. The obligation to invite is clearly evident when imposed by clans on clans, or tribes on tribes. Indeed, it only has meaning if it is offered to others outside the family, the clan, or the phratry. It is essential to invite anyone who can or wishes to come, or actually turns up at the festival at the potlatch. Failure to do so has fatal consequences. An important Tsimshian myth reveals the mentality in which this essential theme of European folklore also originated, that of the wicked fairy who was forgotten at a baptism or a marriage. The tissue of institutions from which the theme is woven is clearly apparent here. We see in what civilizations it functioned. A princess of one of the Tsimshian villages has conceived in the land of the otters, and miraculously gives birth to the little otter. She returns with her child to the village where her father is the chief. Little Otter catches a large halibut, on which his grandfather regales all his fellow chiefs from all the tribes. He presents his grandson to everybody and enjoins them not to kill him if they come across him in his animal form while out fishing. He is my grandson who has brought this food for you, and which I have served to you, my guests. In this way, the grandfather grew rich with all kinds of goods given him when they came to his home, to partake of the whales, seals, and fresh fish that Little Otter brought back during the winter famines. But they had forgotten to invite one chief. So one day, when the crew of a boat belonging to the neglected tribe met Little Otter out at sea, holding a large seal in his mouth, the bowman on the boat killed him and took the seal from him. The grandfather and the other tribes searched for Little Otter until they became aware of what had happened to the forgotten tribe. The latter presented its excuses. It did not know who Little Otter was. His mother, the princess, died of grief. The chief, who had been the unwitting culprit, brought to the chief, the grandfather, all kinds of gifts to expiate his mistake. And the myth concludes, this is why peoples mounted a great festival when the son of a chief was born and was given a name, so that no one should not know who he was. The potlatch, distribution of goods, is the basic act of recognition, military, judicial, economic, and religious in every sense of the word. One recognizes the chief or his son and becomes grateful to him. The ritual followed in the Quiacatul festivals. And those of other tribes in this group sometimes expresses the principle of obligatory invitation. It can happen that a part of the festival begins with the ceremony of the dogs. The latter are represented by the masked men who leave one house and force an entrance into another. This commemorates the time when the people of the three other clans of the Kwakiutl tribe proper omitted to invite the most high-ranking clan among them, the Getala. The latter did not wish to remain profane and, entering the house where the dances were going on, destroyed everything. The obligation to accept is no less constraining. One has no right to refuse a gift
or to refuse to attend the potluck. To act in this way is to show that one is afraid of having to reciprocate, to fear being flattened, for example, losing one's name, until one has reciprocated. In reality, this is already to be flattened. It is to lose the weight attached to one's name. It is either to admit one's self beaten in advance, or, on the contrary, in certain cases, to proclaim oneself the victor and invincible. It seems, at least among the Kwakiutl, that an acknowledged position in the hierarchy and victories in previous potlucks allow one to refuse an invitation, or even, when present at a potluck, to refuse a gift without a war ensuing. Yet, when the potluck becomes obligatory for the one who has refused, in particular, he must make even richer the festival of fat, where this ritual of refusal can, in fact, be observed. The chief, who believes himself to be superior, spurns the spoonful of fat presented to him. He goes to fetch his copper object and returns with it in order to put out the fire of the fat. There follows a succession of formalities that signify the challenge that binds the chief who has refused to give another potluck, another festival of fat. But, in principle, every gift is always accepted and even praised. One must voice one's appreciation of the food that has been prepared for one. But by accepting it, one knows that one is committing oneself. A gift is received with a burden attached. One does more than derive benefit from a thing or festival. One has accepted a challenge and has been able to do so because of being certain to be able to reciprocate, to prove one is not unequal. By confronting one another in this way, chiefs place themselves in a comic situation that is surely perceived as such. As in ancient Gaul or Germany, or at our own banquets for students, soldiers, and peasants, one is committed to gulping down large quantities of food in order to do honor, in a somewhat grotesque way, to one's host. Even if one is only the heir of the person who has made the challenge, it is taken up. To refrain from giving, just as to refrain from accepting, is to lose rank, as is refraining from reciprocating. The obligation to reciprocate constitutes the essence of the potluck, insofar as it does not consist of pure destruction. These acts of destruction are very often sacrificial and beneficial to the spirits. It would seem they need not all be reciprocated unconditionally, particularly when they are the work of the chief recognized in the clan as being superior, or of that of a chief of a clan that has itself already been recognized as superior. However, normally, the potluck must be reciprocated with interest, as must, indeed, every gift. The rate of interest generally ranges from 30 to 100% a year. Even if a subject receives a blanket from his chief for some service he has rendered, he will be given two in return on the occasion of a marriage in the chief's family, or the enthronement of the chief's son, etc. It is true that the latter, in his turn, will give all the goods that he has obtained at future potlucks, when the opposing clans will heap benefits upon him. The obligation to reciprocate worthily is imperative. One loses face forever if one does not reciprocate,
or if one does not carry out destruction of equivalent value. The punishment for failure to reciprocate is slavery for debt. At least this functions among the Kwakyatul, the Haida, and the Tsimshian. It is an institution really comparable in nature and function to the Roman nexum. The individual unable to pay the loan or reciprocate the potlatch loses his rank and even his status as a free man. Among the Kwakyatul, when an individual whose credit is poor borrows, he is said to sell a slave. There is no need to point out the identical nature of this and the Roman expression. The Haida even say, as if they had discovered the Latin expression independently, regarding a mother who gives a present to the mother of a young chief for a betrothal contracted as a minor, that she has put a thread around him. But just as the Trobriand kula is only an extreme case of the exchange of gifts, so the potlatch in societies living on the Northwest American coast is only a kind of monstrous product of the system of presents. At least in the lands of those of the Haida and the Tlingit, where phratries exist, there still remain considerable traces of the one-time total services, which, moreover, are so characteristic of the Athapaskans, the important group of related tribes. Presents are exchanged for any and every reason, for every service, and everything is given back later, or even at once, and is immediately given out again. The Tsimshian are not very far from having kept to the same rules. In numerous cases, the rules even appertain apart from the potlatch among the Kwakyatul. We shall not labor this point, which is self-evident. Older writers describe the potlatch no differently, so much so that one may wonder whether it constitutes a distinct institution. We shall recall that among the Chinook, one of the least well-known tribes, but which might have been among the most important ones to study, the word potlatch signifies a gift, the force of things. One can push the analysis further and demonstrate that in the things exchanged during the potlatch, a power is present that forces gifts to be passed around, to be given and returned. First, at least among the Kwakyatul and Tsimshian, the same distinction is made between the various kinds of property as made by the Romans, the Trobriand peoples, and the Samoans. For these, there exist on the one hand the objects of consumption and for common sharing. I have found no trace of exchanges. And on the other hand, there are the precious things belonging to the family, the various talismans, emblazoned copper objects, blankets made of skins, or cloth bedecked with emblems. The latter type of object is passed on as solemnly as women hand over at marriage the privileges to their sons-in-law, and names and ranks to children and sons-in-law. It is even incorrect to speak in their case of transfer. They are loans rather than sales or true abandonment of possession. Among the Kwakyatul, a certain number of objects, although they appear at the potlatch, cannot be disposed of. In reality, these pieces of property are sacra, that a family divests itself of only with great reluctance, and sometimes never. More detailed observations among the Haida will reveal the same distinctions between things. The latter have in fact even made the notion of property and fortune divine, as did the ancients. Through a mythological and religious effort, fairly infrequent in America, they have raised themselves to a level where they have personified an abstraction. English writers prefer English writers refer to the property woman, about whom there are myths and of whom we have descriptions. For the Haida, she is nothing less than the mother, the originating goddess of the dominant Freya tree, that of the eagles. Yet, on the other hand, and this is a strange fact that awakens very distant recollections of the Asiatic and ancient world, she seems identical to the queen, the main protagonist in the game of sticks, tippet, the one who wins everything and whose name she bears in part. This goddess is to be found in the Tlingit lands, and the myth about her, if not the worship of her among the Tsimshian and the Kwakiutl. The sum of these precious things constitutes the magical dower. This is often identical for both donor and recipient, and also for the spirit who has provided the clan with these talismans, or the hero who is the originator of the clan and to whom the spirit has given them. In any case, all these things are always, and in every tribe, spiritual in origin and of a spiritual nature. Moreover, they are contained in a box, or rather in a large emblazoned case, that is itself endowed with a powerful personality, that can talk, that clings to its owner, that holds his soul, etc. Each of these precious things, these signs of wealth possesses, as in the Trobriand Islands, its individuality, its name, its qualities, its power. The larger abalone shells, the shields that are covered with these shells, the belts and blankets that are decorated with them, the blankets themselves that also bear emblems, covered with faces, eyes, and animal and human figures that are woven and embroidered on them, all are living beings. The houses, the beams, and the decorated walls are also beings. Everything speaks. The roof, the fire, the carvings, the paintings. For the magical house is built not only by the chief or his people, or the people of the opposing Frey tree, but also by one's gods and ancestors. It is the house that both accepts and rejects the spirits and the youthful initiates. Each one of these precious things possesses, moreover, productive power itself. It is not a mere sign and pledge. It is also a sign and a pledge of wealth, the magical and religious symbols of rank and plenty. The dishes and spoons used solemnly for eating and decorated, carved, emblazoned with the clan's totem or the totem of rank are animate things. They are replicas of the inexhaustible instruments, the creators of food that the spirits gave to one's ancestors. They are themselves deemed to have fairy-like qualities. Thus, things are mixed up with spirits, their originators, and eating instruments with food. The dishes of the Kwakiutl and the spoons of the Haida are essential items that circulate according to very strict rules and are meticulously shared out among the clans and the families of the chiefs. The money of fame. Yet above all, it is the emblazoned copper objects that, as basic goods for the potluck, are the focus of important beliefs and even of a cult. First, in every tribe there exists a cult and a myth regarding copper, which is regarded as a living thing. Copper, at least among the Haida and the Kwakito, is identified with the salmon, which is itself the object of a cult. Yet, besides this element of metaphysical and technical mythology, all these pieces of copper are, each one separately, the subject of individual and particular beliefs. Each important piece of copper in the families of the clan chiefs has its name, its own individuality, its own value, in the full sense of the word, magical, economic, permanent, and perpetual, despite the vicissitudes of the potluck through which they pass, and even beyond the partial or complete acts of destruction that they suffer. Moreover, they have a power of attraction that is felt by other copper objects, just as wealth attracts wealth, or dignities bring honors in their train, as well as the possessions of spirits and fruitful alliances, and vice versa. They are alive and move autonomously and inspire other copper objects to do so. One of them is called, among the Kwakyatul, the attractor of copper objects, and the story depicts how the copper objects group around it. At the same time, the name of its owner is property that flows towards me. Another frequent name for copper objects is the bringer of property. Among the Haida and the Tlingit, the copper objects form a strong point around the princess who brings them. Elsewhere, the chief who has them in his possession is rendered invincible. They are the flat, divine things of the household. Often, the myth identifies them all, the spirits that have given the copper objects, their owners, and the copper objects themselves. It is important to distinguish what makes the strength of the spirit in the one and wealth in the other. The copper object speaks and grumbles. It demands to be given away, to be destroyed. It is covered with blankets to keep it warm, just as the chief is buried under blankets that he is to share out. Yet, on the other hand, at the same time as goods, it is wealth and good luck that are passed on. It is in the initiate's spirit. It is his attendant spirits. It is the initiate's spirit. It is his attendant spirits that give the initiate possession of the copper objects, of talismans that themselves are the means of acquiring other things, other copper objects, wealth, rank, and finally, spirits, all things that moreover are of equivalent value. All in all, when one considers both the copper objects and the other permanent forms of wealth that are likewise an object of hoarding and of alternating potlucks, masks, talismans, etc., are all mingled together as regards use and effect. Through them, one obtains rank. It is because one obtains wealth that one obtains a spirit. The latter, in its turn, takes possession of the hero who has overcome all obstacles. Then again, this hero has his shaman trances, his ritual dances, and the services of his government paid for him. Everything holds together. Everything is mixed up together. Things possess a personality, and the personalities are, in some way, the permanent things of the clan. Titles, talismans, copper objects, and the spirits of the chiefs are both homonyms and synonyms of the same nature and performing the same function. The circulation of goods follows that of men, women, and children,
of feasts, rituals, and ceremony, of feasts, rituals, ceremonies, and dances, and even that of jokes and insults. All in all, it is one and the same. If one gives things and returns them, it is because one is giving and returning respects. We still say courtesies. Yet it is also because by giving one is giving oneself, and if one gives oneself, it is because one owes oneself, one's person, and one's goods to others. First conclusion. Thus, in 4 important population groups, we have discovered the following. First, in 2 or 3 groups, the potluck, then the main reason for, and the normal form of the potluck itself, and what is more, beyond the potluck, and in all of these groups, the archaic form of exchange, that of gifts presented and reciprocated. Moreover, we have identified the circulation of things in these societies with the circulation of rights and persons. We could, if we wanted, stop there. The number, extent, and importance of these facts justifies fully our conception of a regime that must have been shared by a very large part of humanity during a very long transitional phase, one that, moreover, still subsists among the people we have described. These phenomena allow us to think that this principle of the exchange gift must have been that of societies that have gone beyond the phase of total services, from clan to clan, from family to family, but have not yet reached that of purely individual contract, of the market where money circulates, of sale proper, and above all, the notion of price reckoned in coinage, weighed and stamped with its value. That is the end of chapter 2. Remember to check the comments, because books like this are not just meant to be read. And of course, I'll also post a little quizzy poo to test your knowledge.